me and my family and a great deal to Hong Kongers. But first of all, I want to follow what Ed was saying this evening and thank everybody involved in Hong Kong Watch for all that you've done for an extremely important organization, both because of the impact on the morale of the distinguished diaspora that we have with us in this country, but also because of the keeping up the pressure which is needed, I'm afraid, still. And it's needed for every government in this country to go on speaking up for Hong Kong and speaking up against some of the atrocious behavior of the Chinese government in Beijing. There are people who speak up for what it's doing in Hong Kong. There are people who speak up for it. And they fall, in my judgment, into two categories. There's a sort of racist element, which is very often people from Britain who spend some time in Hong Kong, but sometimes it's others as well, who say, I didn't know why people bang on about democracy in Hong Kong and the rule of law in Hong Kong. Chinese don't care about these things. They only want to make money. It's such an appallingly racist observation. It is plainly untrue. You look at Taiwan or you look elsewhere in the world, and it's obviously a grotesque lie. And the other thing, which I think sometimes has people pitching in on the other side, is, to be blunt, commercial interest. Our now ambassador in Washington, who's not one of my best friends, so you have to lay off of that, went to Hong Kong about this time last year, maybe a bit later, and gave a series of speeches, not least a lecture in Hong Kong University, about how Britain had forgotten about Hong Kong and how we'd had to take advantage of all the things we should be doing to develop our relationship with China. And I talked to a couple of spooks afterwards about this, saying it's sort of strange. I hadn't been aware of his views on Hong Kong and China before. And I said, is there anything behind it? And one of my spook friends said, well, look at the clients of Global Counsel, which is his firm. And top of the list was Huawei. So not surprisingly, he was saying what he had said. And I think we have to be aware of the fact that that will happen again and again, who think that very much for their own pocketbook reasons, we should ensure that China continues to have the mandate of heaven when it comes to discussing any international issue. Just let me say a few things about Hong Kong, and inevitably they're rather personal. As somebody said, a couple of you said earlier, this is quite an important date for my family and for me. I had a phone call this morning from my former porte-parole in Hong Kong, who's now, alas, not very well, an Australian, who said, you know what we were doing? He said, 28 years ago this morning, he said we were taking our leave. We weren't quite waiting in the queue at the airport, but we were certainly departing. And it's true. And I was talking to my wife about what it was like at the time when we were leaving a post which had given us both more pleasure and satisfaction than anything else I've done. Not the most difficult. The most difficult job I had to do was reorganizing the police in Northern Ireland. But this was a job which had given us great satisfaction. And leaving it that night, somebody said to me, do you think it'll go all right? And I said, well, what I can't understand is why, given the amount of finicky detail they went into about everything, why, given the amount of trouble they caused about everything, should they now stand back and whip it all up? Well, it was in a lot of senses very different from any other British colony, because everywhere else you were preparing colonies for independence and for democracy. We would buy volumes by E.E. Jennings on the British Constitution and scatter them over the country. We would ensure that there were judges in wigs and free speech and a bicameral legislature, and then a member of the royal family, quite often a member of the royal family that nobody in the country concerned had ever heard of, would go out and they'd become independent. We'd light the deep blue touch paper and blast the community off into orbit, and sometimes it would work and sometimes it didn't. To a surprising number of occasions, it worked very well. But Hong Kong was never going to be like that, because we had Hong Kong on a lease, or the largest part of it, for 99 years. And as Joe and I used to say to his opposite numbers before we left, some time before we left, whenever we tried to start democracy there, we mustn't give people the wrong impression. Hong Kong isn't going to be like Singapore or Malaysia. It's not going to become an independent country, it's coming back to us. And so it was. And the moral problem we had was how we dealt with that. There was a moral problem for the Chinese as well, a political and a moral problem, which is when they said that Hong Kong had never been a British colony, they said it had been an occupied territory. The question they never answered was who's occupied it? It had been occupied by waves of people who were fleeing Chinese communism, who were swimming, who were clambering over barbed wire, who were like Jimmy Lai stowaways to get to a British colony as a safe haven. So it was difficult for them and it was difficult for us, because it was a free society and we knew we were handing it back to a society that wasn't free. We might have our hopes about what would happen, but I always thought it was strange that the last official visit that I made when I was in Hong Kong, when I was governor, was to a mental hospital. I'm walking past the wards, and there's one guy who, there was wire around the wards. There's one guy rattling the wire as we went past, and to the horror of my officials and civil servants and the doctors, I went across and spoke to him. He was very smartly dressed in a three-piece grey suit and spoke very good English. And he said, Pang Ting Hong, he said, Governor Patten, could you answer one question for me? What, two questions? He said, first of all, would you regard Britain as the greatest and earliest democracy in the world? And I said, well, some people would certainly argue that. And he said, would you say that China is the last great communist tyranny in the world? And I said, I might not say that publicly, but I get your point. So he said, well, can you explain this to me? How is it that the greatest democracy in the world is handing over to the last great communist tyranny, the people of Hong Kong, without asking what they want? Well, we never could. But I remember saying to my officials afterwards, there it is, the guy with the best question in Hong Kong is in a mental hospital. But it was the question which always made the issue for us politically and morally hazardous. And we thought we could get round it, and it was a reasonable thought, by a negotiated agreement with Chinese based on Deng Xiaoping's view, made for Taiwan, really, one country, two systems. Now, it slightly begged the question of whether the Chinese ever really understood the Hong Kong system. I think, in retrospect, we didn't press them too hard on whether they did understand the Hong Kong system. I think they usually used to think it was just a question of allowing the Cantonese to get filthy rich. But that was what underpinned the joint declaration, which at Chinese insistence was tabled as an international agreement at the UN. It wasn't us that suggested that, it was the Chinese who suggested that. So it's therefore of some consequence some interest that on that, as on so many other things, the Chinese broke their word. Now, this isn't an anti-Chinese sentiment. It's a question from somebody who's deeply critical of the Chinese Communist Party. The best recent modern histories of Chinese communism, Communist Party, and of China are written by a historian who spent most of his life in Australia called Frank de Cotter. And you read them all, and the underlying argument is that the Chinese Communist Party is incapable of reforming itself, because it can't reform itself without cutting away the roots of its authority. So here we were walking away from the Chinese with an agreement in which they were going to keep one country, two systems, but didn't really understand what the Hong Kong system was, and certainly didn't want to concede a degree of self-government to, whatever they said, to Hong Kongers. And the rest, as the podcast puts it, the rest is history. We know what has actually happened in the years since. And we know how there are many people who continue to think that we shouldn't criticize China, because to do so is to undercut our commercial interests and is to deny them the mandate of heaven which they deserve. Commercial interests? I used to get this the whole time. We used to get this the whole time when I was governor of Hong Kong. The figures were that during the period I was there, exports from Britain and investment in Britain from China, exports from Britain went up faster than in any other OECD country. You can look it up. Whereas before we were there, with all those rows, actually exports were going down, because the Chinese actually do business exactly the same way as everybody else. They buy what they want at the best price they can get, and if they get on the side, that the other country thinking it has to go on its knees in order to do the deal. If you look at what's happened over the last, I won't bang on for much longer, but if you look at what's happened recently about the coronavirus and about the World Health Organization, Wang Yi, who was then and still is the Chinese, but with an interim, I think, the Chinese foreign minister, went to Australia at the beginning of the coronavirus, and he was asked by the Australians what was happening in Wuhan, and he said, well, there was some influenza, but what was happening was entirely controllable and wasn't transmissible. And at the same time, the Australians discovered that the Chinese were buying hand-over fist PPE equipment from Australia and from other people. So the Chinese then asked for a WHO inquiry, at which point the Chinese announced that they weren't going to buy any more Australian exports. The trouble is, they needed Australian exports. They needed barley, they needed ore, they needed other things. And 2 years later, even after all the fuss and people in Australia and the world had been outraged at Chinese behaviour, Chinese imports for Australia were higher than they've been before that allegation. So it's smoke and mirrors a great deal of the time, and we shouldn't actually allow for that. They're very smart at dealing with it and doing it, but you can't surprise them. You can't blame them if they actually believe what people like HSBC say about our attitudes to democracy and our attitudes to what they're doing. So, just a few last thoughts about Hong Kong Watch. First of all, it's incredibly important that Hong Kong Watch and other representatives of the huge and talented diaspora in this country go on speaking out for Hong Kong and speaking out for the diaspora. And the idea that the government should actually make the B&O passport more restrictive than it is completely absurd.
Indeed.
It does absolutely nothing to the immigration figures, which is one of the reasons why it would be so barking to do it. It just looks as though you're being tough. Tough with whom? Tough with all these talented people who are now making this a better and richer country because they've come here, because they've driven here by a sort of gangster regime in Hong Kong. Secondly, there are some particular causes and some people that I feel extremely strongly about. And I can think of some who've been behaved very badly in not standing up for them. And one's a personal. Jimmy Lai was a friend of mine. If the Chinese government know that in my study where I write most of the time, I've got 2 paintings that Jimmy Lai gave me. Jimmy Lai is a very good example of what Hong Kong was capable of doing. And somebody smart enough to know about the importance of the relationship between economic and political freedom. He's a Chinese patriot, as is Anson Chan, but understands those things to his foot, to his toes, to his shoes. Jimmy Lai has now been locked up for more than 40 years. More than 4 years. It would be 40 if the Chinese had their way. He's in solitary confinement. He's a Catholic, and a passionate Catholic, and I think his Catholicism and the fact that the holy paint pictures he draws every day is one of the things that keeps him alive. The local regime refused to allow him Holy Communion every week. It's monstrous. I've tried to get the Vatican, I've tried to get the last Pope, who unfortunately was obsessed with Matteo Ricci. I'll try to get this Vatican to speak out about it. It is absolutely appalling. And I think it's very important that we continue to press the government to insist that Jimmy Lai should have consular privileges and should have visits from the consul in Hong Kong, which isn't allowed at the moment. And there are other prisoners there who I think we should be equally tough in arguing for. And I also think we should be very tough on the whole question of surveillance of the Hong Kong community by the Chinese in this country. And I cannot think, to go back to what Tom was saying, I cannot think of a single reason why the Chinese need an embassy in London, which is bigger than 4 White Houses.
No,
I mean, they're completely barking. So, and I think we should go on trying to remind the media, as well as the government, what's actually happening in Hong Kong and why we should care about it. My favorite American politician was Adlai Stevenson, who said, you should not only be prepared to fight for your values, you should also live up to them. And that is sometimes a lot more difficult. But we should remind people, as Tom said, that what happened in Hong Kong today, unless we stand up about it, will happen elsewhere tomorrow. The most difficult question I ever have to answer, I got it again the other day talking to about 120 Hong Kong students in Oxford. And 2 or 3 of them said to me, look, we're finishing our doctorates or just qualified as a doctor. Should we go back to Hong Kong? It's an impossible question for me to answer. What would I say if it was my kids? I'd be a bit cautious. The only thing I can do is the thing that all of us who are in politics know when we're doing it, is blah blah, is try a few long words without ever defining what they mean. So what I always say is, well, I think the things that you believe in, and I think that things that Hong Kong has stood for in the past, are more likely to survive than the things that the Chinese Communist Party allegedly stands for. Now, I don't know what that means for events in the last few
next few months or years. But I think you should stick to your principle, and I hope you will. But it's a difficult thing to say to people. I had to say it the other day to a Hong Kong bus conductor in Putney, who wanted me to know whether he should go back to Hong Kong. You say to people again and again, it must have been a terrible blow for you to leave Hong Kong. It must have been a terrible blow for many of you. To leave families behind, to leave behind a city which was a beacon around the world for the relationship between economic and political freedom. To leave family, friends, house, and also whatsoever. And they also say, again and again and again, as though they'd been told to say it, but it comes from the heart. They say, well, it was a big, terrible wrench for us, but we wanted to bring up our children in freedom. And I think sometimes those of us who have lived in a free society always take it for granted. Go on helping Hong Kong Watch and go on speaking out for Hong Kong, a very great city and a very great community.